Recently, I rebuilt from scratch a 100-year-old Singer sewing machine, and I want to see how it compares to a modern heavy-duty sewing machine that you can buy for around 200 bucks. So this is my beautiful 100-year-old Singer Simanco sewing machine. It is operated by a foot pedal and it requires no electricity. This is the first of the machines that I will be testing. The other one, this plastic monstrosity, is my beloved Singer heavy-duty sewing machine. Let's start with the vintage one. This is made out of cast iron and it's only mechanical, so there is no electricity required, and I think that it is absolutely beautiful. I've spent a lot of time on it. And this one is almost all plastic except for the main shaft and the bottom main shaft. And other than that, it requires electricity and you need to use a foot pedal to operate it. The pedal has a tempomat, so that means the harder you press, the faster you will sew. To have a fair test, I'm going to sew the same backpack on both machines. And this will decide if one is better than the other and how much of a pain it is to use a 100-year-old machine in comparison to a brand new one. First, I'm going to need some materials, and for that I'm going to be using leather and this heavy fabric. I think that the combination of these two will be quite challenging for both of the machines. Now for the sewing pattern. This is just a simple backpack that I've already done like a couple of times on my plastic machine, so I hope that my skills won't be an issue here. However, I am not a professional by any means, so I'm not a professional tailor, nor do I sew for a living. But I think that I have enough experience so that my skills with each machine won't really matter. I've sewn about 50 bags with my Singer Heavy Duty, and I've sewn about 10 to 15 with my vintage machine. So I think I can make an unbiased comparison. I chose a leather backpack for this comparison because I want to test how many layers each sewing machine can sew through consistently and without too much of a hassle. So 2 or 3 are going to be fine, I think, but at 4 there's gonna be some issues. So, here's the first test. I want to see how quick it is to get each machine ready. So I'm going to wind up the threads and also thread up the needles and see just how long it takes to get started on each of the machines. The process of setting up these machines is quite simple. I just need to do 2 things. First, I need to wind up thread onto a bobbin, and then I need to insert it into the machine. On the top part, I also need to add thread through some levers and then insert it into the needle of the machine. The main difference between the 2 machines is the bobbin winding mechanism. On one side you can see that a motor does it, on the other side I have to do it by hand and by foot, and that means controlling the tension is quite difficult. But in the end I think I managed to do it pretty fast on both machines, and there's really not that big of a difference in time. I consider this result to be pretty similar, so 15 seconds doesn't really mean that much, because I'm just doing this as a hobby and I'm not a business, not making any money of this. So let's get started in sewing the backpacks. I hope that the machines will be pushed somewhat to their limits, but we'll see. The first thing that I'm going to sew is the bottom half of the backpack. These are just 4 corners joined together, but there are 2 small flaps sandwiched in between 2 layers of leather, and this is going to be the challenging part. Since I know my sewing machine can go through about 2 layers of leather without any difficulty, 4 layers is going to be a whole different story. So 2 layers, not that big of an issue. But this is the flap that will hold the strap of the backpack, and I need to sandwich it in between 2 other layers of leather. So as you can see, my machine is struggling quite a bit and I'm having to hand crank it. And this gives me a bit more control, but it is also very, very slow. If I try to push the motor when the leather is too thick, this happens. The needle breaks. So I opt for hand cranking. But in the end, I managed to do quite an okay stitch on these 4 layers of leather. Now let's move on to the vintage machine. One of the best features of this vintage machine is the hand crank and also the foot pedal. You have so much control with this. You can stop when you want to, you can start when you want to, and it is really much more precise than my modern machine. And with this I could make short work and precise work of these flaps. The only thing that this vintage machine doesn't have is different types of stitches and also having a back stitch. So I need to move the workpiece around to do a couple of back stitches to sew out the loose thread that is on the needle. And this can be quite a hassle if your workpiece is pretty large or if it's in an awkward shape. So here I've joined two layers together and folded it out, and as you can see it's pretty even and it looks quite decent. But with 4 layers, unfortunately the needle stops because of the friction, so I need to use the hand crank once again. However, on this machine the hand crank is way easier to use because it's way bigger and has more weight behind it. So that means that it acts quite like a small flywheel. And here's the result. I think it turned out comparably good to the other one. So I didn't notice that much of a difference in stitch quality with the 4 layers of leather. Now let's move on to the body of the bag. This is a quite thick fabric, but it is really easy to sew through. So you can see that I'm making short work of it. It really isn't worth to compare the speed of both machines because they can both sew really fast. But the vintage sewing machine can also sew precisely and slowly, and that is a feature that is not available on my heavy-duty sewing machine. I wanted to add some decor to the backpack, so I'm going to use these decorative straps on the side of the body of the backpack, and I think that these two colors really look nicely together. I'm gonna fix it in place with this double-sided tape and then sew through both the fabric and 2 layers of leather. This shouldn't be an issue and both machines should accomplish this beautifully. However, since the stitch is easy, there has to be some other type of complication, and that is the form that I'm going to be using. So basically this is a cylinder of fabric that I want to sew something to the side of. And I can't just sew through the whole thing since I would then join the 2 sides of the cylinder together. So what I need to do is bend the fabric into this banana shape to expose its underbelly and then sew like this. This is a bit easier on my heavy-duty machine since I can remove its underside, and that leaves me with a smaller work surface and it's easier to bend the fabric on it. When sewing on these long stretches of leather with a contrasting color of thread to the leather, then it is pretty important to keep the tension as consistent as you can so that you have consistent stitches coming out and the whole thing looks neat and tidy. Even though the fabric was in an awkward position, I think that this heavy-duty machine could handle it with ease. So that's 2 layers of leather and also 2 layers of fabric. On the vintage machine I was running into some trouble because you need to start the hand crank with some momentum and you need to keep the fabric in your hands straight. So that means that I have too few hands to keep everything tidy. But in the end the result speaks for itself and I've made comparably similar stitches on both machines. I need a bit more practice with straightening out my lines, but I think that this result is pretty okay. Here you can see me making some difficult moves since the bottom half of the backpack is quite an awkward shape and joining it to the main body is a bit difficult. But the fabric is not thick on any side, so there's just 1 layer of leather and also 1 layer of fabric, so both machines can handle this pretty easily. And that's the bottom half of the backpack done. Now let's check it on the vintage machine. As you can see, the whole machine is essentially a giant table, and this makes it quite a bit more challenging to work the fabric in a precise way and to make your stitches look tidy. But I could manage after a bit of practice.
but I needed some practice. So starting out, your stitches are not going to be that consistent on this vintage type of machine. For the closing and opening of the backpack, I want to use some really thick rope, and for that I need to add some ringlets into the top strap that is going to be attached to the top half of the backpack. Here you can see me making this strap. I've punched out some holes and added some ringlets. Two of these ringlets are going to serve as the straps for the backpack, and the others will be for the action of closing and opening the bag. Now I'm going to use a French seam to join the two halves of this top strap together. And for that I'm using this really easy contact adhesive which dries in about a minute. After gluing it in place, I just sew down the two bunny ears, and this is your French seam. It is a really nice looking seam, and it's also pretty strong. This black thread that you see me using is a really quite heavy gauge, and it's mainly used in leatherwork because of this feature that you can burn off the ends and it makes it stick into the leather so that it won't come loose even after years of use. With a simple French seam, there really isn't that big of a comparison between the two machines. The only thing that I can think of is the width of the foot of the sewing machine is a bit thinner on the vintage one, and I didn't account for this, and that's why the stitches on one of these straps is a bit closer together. So that's the vintage one and that's the brand new one. Now here comes a difficult stitch. I need to attach this French seam part to the back half of the backpack, and that means going through 4 layers of leather and also 2 layers of fabric. This is gonna be a heavy job, so I chose some heavy needles and removed the bottom half of my heavy duty machine. This is, as I've mentioned before, one of the best features of the heavy duty Singer machine, that you can sew these cylinder types of shapes really easily with this machine. So it's not gonna be as easy on the vintage one, but still I will manage. I just need to bend the fabric a certain way. After getting through the thick part, the other half is pretty easy to sew through, so I'm just gonna speed through this. When you are sewing leather to some softer fabric, so like this heavy textile, then I recommend Frenching at least one of the seams. So I'm going to French this leather seam because this will make the tension in the top part of the backpack quite even, and that is, I think, required if you're trying to make a nice looking product. As with the other thick part, it is really easy to hand crank this through with the vintage machine. But here you can see again the back stitching process. So I need to turn the fabric around a couple of times to sew out the loose thread from my needle. After finishing this top seam and also Frenching it, I only have a couple of finishing steps that I need to complete, and then the backpack will be finished. On the vintage machine I did this French seam in 2 parts, so the thick part first and then the other half. As you can see, my stitches in this top part are really not that nice looking, but they have to be mechanically stable and have to be really strong, so unfortunately I had to compromise a bit between strength and look.
Now is just a matter of finishing the backpacks, and I'm going to speed through this process because it takes a long time. And what basically I'm doing is just sewing a lid for the backpack, making some quick lining out of some silk material that I found, and also threading up the ropes for the backpack to be worn.
This is going to be the top half of the backpack, so the flap that you can use to close it up so that no rain will fall in. And I just glue it in place and then use a hammer to stretch the leather into this weird shape, and as you can see it really doesn't want to conform. So I glue it up the best as I can and then sew it down. This is where the vintage machine shines really well, because you can hand crank the corners and then you can speed through the straight sections. I've tried to disassemble my heavy duty machine, so the plastic one, and attach a different hand crank that could be easier grasped and that is a bit heavier so that I can sew a bit slower. But unfortunately it is really welded into place, so there's no chance of me getting that thing out. And I've noticed one mod on the internet for a 3D printed hand crank that you can attach on the outside of the hand crank of the heavy duty machine, and I've yet to come around to print it because it is quite a large print and it costs a bunch of money. But if I eventually do it on my 3D printer, then I hope that this can solve some of these issues that I'm having with hand cranking on the other machine. Here you can see that I've added some black lining, and this is really just an internal lining, so nothing too complicated. This is an 8mm thick nylon rope that I'm going to be using to make the bag's straps and also the closing mechanism. So I designed this closing mechanism really by just looking at other rope bags, and I think that I've managed to come up with a good design, but on the first iterations I noticed that some rain fell into the backpack because I didn't have that top flap to cover it up. So I decided to fix it by adding it. And I think that it also elevates the look of the bag from just a simple gym bag to something a bit more. I hope you agree, and if you don't, and by the way, if you don't agree with anything that I've said in the video, please share your thoughts with me in the comment section below, and I will strive to answer every single one of them. After this, I've decided to add some magnetic clamps for the top flap on the bag, and I think that this shiny chrome look will match with the ringlets that I've added to the bag. So hopefully it will look consistent and like it's a product that was not just thrown together. I buy all my hardware in bulk so that it's way cheaper than if I had just bought it at a haberdashery. So it's like 500% cheaper, so it's really obvious to buy it in bulk. And I usually buy like 50 pieces of each thing. So I had a bunch of these magnetic clamps laying around, and I think that it suits the backpack quite nicely. And with that, the bag is finally complete.
Now the backpack is finally finished. Actually, I made 5 of them. 1 on the modern sewing machine and 4 on the vintage sewing machine. I gave 1 away to my little sister, so that means I have 4 of them to sell on some local Hungarian website. I don't plan on making much money from this, but it was a cool experiment. And before I show you the final beauty shots and share my thoughts on both machines, I would like to ask you to subscribe to my channel if you enjoy the work that I do and would care to support me. So, all in all, I think both machines are really great and I love sewing on both of them. But for leather work, and especially for those really thick leather pieces that you have to sew through, I would recommend using the vintage sewing machine, because the hand crank's action is way easier to use, and it's also gives a bit more control, if I'd have to say, because you can stop it with your foot and you don't have that option on the modern machine. However, one of the most redeeming qualities of the modern sewing machine is the removable base. So when you want to sew around kind of this sack type of stitch, then it's way easier to just slide it under the sewing machine than to have to struggle with the fabric and the way it flows and have to constantly stop. So in that case I would opt for the modern sewing machine. But that's pretty much it. I think that I will continue to use both. Initially I had the plans to sell my vintage sewing machine because it takes up a lot of space, and that's kind of a big drawback, but I've grown accustomed to it and I really like the design. So it's gonna stay in my room, and when I eventually move out of my parents' house, it's gonna have to come with me. I mean, I'm not leaving such a beautiful thing behind. And I could probably sell it for like, I don't know, $500, but that's just really not worth it for me yet. So hopefully the price goes up, or I get bored with it or something, but until then I'm gonna keep it, and I'm gonna sew some beautiful things with it. With that said, I hope you enjoyed my video, and if you did, please give a thumbs up. Other than that, see you guys next time. Bye bye.